Thanks for joining, everybody. We'll just give it another minute before we get started in case there's any latecomers. Okay, we'll get underway. Thank you all for joining tonight with our webinar. Huge thank you to Boehringer Ingelheim for organising the webinar this evening. Before I introduce Dr. Eden, so the way this will run, if you have any questions to ask Carl, feel free to either put them in the meeting chat section or the Q&A section, or alternatively you can press the raise your hand button on the top of your screen, and that'll light up who you are, and then I can unmute you so that you can ask the question. I think from Carl's perspective, he would prefer if you're going to raise your hand to wait until the end. But if you've got a pressing question that you think needs to come through, then feel free to do it at the time and we can open it up. But otherwise, I will hand it over to Carl and you can go on with your presentation.
Thanks, Amelia, and thank you for that introduction. So, yes, I'm Carl Eden, veterinarian with Boehringer Ingelheim, based here in the Waikato. Now, tonight we'll probably chat for somewhere around about half an hour to 40 minutes, and the topic we've chosen to talk about this evening is drenching of adult cattle. Now, I want to start off and just say that tonight's presentation is not a instruction to drench all your adult cattle, and neither is it an instruction not to drench all of your adult cattle. I hope by the end of this evening we'll have gone through some of the factors and the choices that influence whether or not you should or shouldn't drench your adult cattle. And the presentation is designed to be a little bit thought-provoking. At the end of this presentation, if you've got further questions around your particular herd, I really do encourage you to discuss those with your veterinarian. They are best placed to provide you advice specific to your property. They know your property much better than I do. So that being said, I will kick on in and we'll make a start. So we're going to talk tonight about gastrointestinal nematodes, or gin. So some of you might be sitting here with a glass of gin. I'm not sure. I'm not. I've got a cup of coffee. But gin tonight is about gastrointestinal nematodes and not the drink. We'll touch on resistance. We'll have a little bit of discussion around resistance. We'll talk a little bit about, do adult cattle need drenching, and when should we consider when we should drench those cattle? We'll talk a little bit about return on investment. That return on investment is really centered around the effect of EPRINEX on parasites and the potent effect on parasites. So in a lot of regards, if you've got parasites there, you can expect potentially to have a return on investment, and if you haven't, then perhaps you won't. We'll talk more to that. We'll talk a little bit as we go through the presentation around EPRINEX, the product, and then we'll finalise out with some discussions around times when you might want to treat your adult dairy cattle for worms. So, quite rightly so, there's a lot of dialogue around the benefits of treating adult cattle for parasites. I'm not going to go into this evening into the treatment of young stock calves and those aspects. That's probably a topic for another day. As I say, I'm going to focus more on adult cattle. But there is a lot of dialogue around whether or not we should be treating them, whether we shouldn't be treating them, or whether we can just let their immunity deal with parasites. Now, a lot of our behaviours in relation to drenching adult cattle come from belief that it works, or belief that it doesn't work, belief that it is of value, or belief that it is of no value. Now, there is a difference between believing something. You may have confidence in the truth, but belief is generally comes without absolute proof that one is doing the right thing. So the information I want to share tonight is really about changing that belief, whether it's to drench or not to drench, into more of thinking. So when we think, we use evidence, we have a conscious mind, and we use reasoning as to why we make a particular decision. So as I said, that's what I hope to achieve in tonight's presentation. Now, if we think about EPRINEX is a drench globally that has had the most number of post-registrational trials of any drench globally. That is a drench that's had trials into efficacy, both on ecto and endoparasites. We've also had trials into the production effects, both here in New Zealand and also globally. And then various other ones. So, obviously things that we think about with a drench, importance, especially in the dairy sector, is residues or withhold periods. It's the only drench with a worldwide zero withhold period for milk and also for meat. And there are a number of other trials totaling 439. So I'm not going to talk about all of them tonight, and I promise I won't be going into all of them in a significant amount of detail. We'll probably only touch on 3 or 4. So what worms are we going to be talking about tonight? Primarily going to talk to 3 species. So if we talk about the names or the genus of nematodes, we have our ostes, our Couperia, and our trikes. So our Ostatagia, they tend to cause problems mostly in weaners, yearlings, and young adults, and the time of year is generally late winter to spring. From a resistance perspective, we do see some resistance from the Ostatagia species emerging. And, from a point of view of that data, trial data there's not enough of it in a lot of regards. And monitoring of resistance is something that needs to be done on a farm basis. So there is some evidence around Ostatagia and having resistance around the benzimidazoles and the macrocyclic lactones. So if we think then to Couperia, tends to affect our calves and weaners, so younger stock, again, autumn and spring, and certainly resistance to the Couperia species has been around in New Zealand and globally for quite some time. It tends to be across the board with various classes of drench being affected. And even one of the tools that we've been using for quite some years around levamisole shows some evidence in certain areas of resistance too. And then we have our trikes, and these sort of sit somewhere in between the osties and the coops from a point of view of the age of the animals they're affecting. Again, autumn and spring tend to be the time when we're getting the main problems, and there has been resistance detected to trikes as well. So that being said, from a point of view of the talk tonight, we're talking about adult cattle. We're going to focus in mostly on our Ostatagia species, and then we're going to do that from the perspective of the fact that these adult cows can actually harbour inhibited larvae, and how might we go about dealing with those, or even identifying whether or not those cows actually have a parasite burden in the first place. So the first place I just want to start is on the basics of the gastrointestinal worm life cycle. Now, I'm not going to go into specific species here, but essentially all worms have to have a life cycle in order to complete their progeny, as it were. So there's a stage in the animal with adult worms. Those adult worms will lay eggs. Those eggs will get onto the paddock and the pasture and will hatch out into larvae. Those larvae, generally larval stage 3, are the infective stage that are then picked up by the animal. The life cycle completes itself. It's important to note that in order for a parasite to pass on genetic material, i.e. resistance traits or other survivability traits, that life cycle has to complete. So these are the 3 topics we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to talk a little bit about resistance, specifically on adult cattle. Then we're going to move into the question around, do adult cattle need drenching? And then we'll look at the return on investment. So I'm really going to frame the research around those 3 areas. So from a resistance perspective, again, when we think about the context of tonight's talk, we're talking about adult cattle. And in order for resistance to be propagated onto the paddocks, we really need to have an adult worm population that are producing eggs that then produce those resistant larvae. It's probably, maybe we can ask the question, how often do you find that when you've got adult cattle and you do a fecal egg count, that you have a positive fecal egg count? The answer to that is quite often you don't. There's a 0 egg count. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the cow doesn't have parasites. It means that she's not producing eggs. And there are a number of reasons why that might be the case. The primary one is immunity. So over time, the cattle or our species develop an immunity to the parasites. That does develop over time. And basically, like most immune responses, it results from exposure to the challenge, in this case, parasites. So it's an immune response. And as those animals are continually challenged by larval challenge on an ongoing basis, it effectively acts like a booster, like a vaccine booster. Their immune system is boosted to protect them from the parasites. Now, that protection is never complete protection. It does wax and wane, and it can be affected by things such as stress or cortisol, and at times of the life cycle, such as leading up to calving. What that immunity does with those parasites is essentially it does something we call it decreases the fecundity of those parasites. And what that means is the first stage is it actually prevents the parasites from laying eggs. As that immunity develops, it'll actually stunt the worm growth. It'll actually cause some retardation of an arrested development of the parasites, and ultimately can actually lead to adult worm expulsion. And that means over time that particular animal is then resistant to the establishment of new infections. So as I say, it starts with the eggs, it moves into retarding and stunting the development of the worm, and ultimately resistance to establishment of new infections. So the key point I want to make here in relation to resistance and drenching adult cattle is if you do have an adult burden in those cattle, the likelihood of them contaminating the pasture with eggs is very, very small. And as the cattle age and their immunity increases, the effect or the likelihood of them contaminating the pasture is reduced. Those that are contaminating the pasture will be in small numbers, and that could have a dilution effect on the larvae already on the pasture, making it unlikely that you'll get a change in the genetic parasite population that moves towards resistance. So that's the first point. The second thing to think about is, do they actually have worms? So if we've got cattle with 0 or very low fecal egg counts, should we be drenching those cattle? So let's just move away from parasites for a second. One of the most important things when we were working on our farms is obviously ensuring that our new stock that we're bringing into the herd, our grown heifers, are fertile. We want them to be producing good milk and to compete with those mature cows to survive within the herd. We know that bringing them in with good live weight gain and targets is the right thing to do. It leads to better reproductive performance, and we know that managing those heifers joining to meet live weight targets is a well towards strategy from a point of view of getting them into the herd and managing them from a reproductive and ongoing perspective. So that all requires positive energy balance and freedom from disease. And at the end of the day, the freedom from disease is really about the effects of inflammation on those heifers. So when we think about any of our adult cattle heifers or our multiparous cows, if they do have a worm burden, there is going to be an ongoing inflammatory response to those worms' presence and their migration in that animal. That potentially could cause ongoing damage to the gastrointestinal lining, and through that process, we actually get a reduced feed intake, a reduced appetite, and that leads to our reduced production and growth. What I'm talking about in this instance specifically is mostly attributed to our osteitis, and is a process that's called hyperplastic gastritis. Essentially, that is what that means, what that translates to, is thickening of the gut due to inflammation. How that comes about, and on the left here is a histopathological specimen showing the stomach wall on the lumen. It's basically the stomach content side, and you can see in the mucosa here a larvae in the gastric glands. Now, the presence of those larvae creates an inflammatory response and also increases the secretion of gastrin. And gastrin is what we call a satiety hormone, so it decreases appetite. It's secreted when an animal is full, that gastrin decrease in the appetite can decrease the grazing time of that particular animal. So the presence of these things could reduce feed intake. So what's the evidence behind that? If we look at a study done by Forbes in 2004, they took 40 cows, they divided them into two groups of 20 cows, and essentially they managed those cows on separate paddocks in groups of 2, where they had a heifer and a mature cow in each of the groups. 20 of the cows were not treated, and 20 of the cows were treated with EPRINEX, and they had naturally acquired infection, which on pre and post-treatment fecal egg counts showed a low egg per gram, so consistent with what we've been talking about earlier, and a mixed infection of Osteigia, Cooperia, and Trikes. What they were looking at was aspects around grazing behaviour, milk production, body condition score, and live weight gain. And what they saw in this particular group was there were significant differences between the grazing time, eating time, the total amount of bites, the total jaw movements, the idling time, i.e. the time chewing cud, and the mean meal duration in those cows that were treated with EPRINEX. And they also saw increased milk solids across the board in that treated group as well. Now, the question is often asked, was that driven primarily by the heifers or were the cows? And if we start to break it out between the heifers and the cows, you can see there is a difference. And I mentioned earlier on that immunity develops over time, so you would expect cows to have a higher level of immunity to parasites than the heifers. And you can see that the impacts of the treatment with EPRINEX on the heifers and the cows was different. There still was an increased amount of grazing time in the cows, not quite as much as the heifers. Same for the eating time and the idling time. And then when we look at the milk production effect that was seen in this particular trial, for those heifers, there was a greater milk yield increase for 2 and 3 weeks post-treatment. And whilst there was an improvement in the multiparous cows, it was not as large as what was seen in the heifers. From a point of view of live weight gain, body condition score, again, significantly in favour of the treated group. So do we have hyperplastic gastritis in our cows? If we look overseas and we look at some studies that were done in Belgium and the Netherlands, they demonstrated that just about all the cows had these stomach worms, as Osteigia, and a lot of these animals, 15% of them, had high worm burdens. Some similar studies done in France and UK looked at abattoir grading of the lesions in the cattle, and in those studies they were counting the actual lesions, and they found that there was a significant number of those that had greater than 100 parasites at slaughter. So there was evidence that this hyperplastic gastritis, this continual challenge by stomach worms, was a problem overseas. For those that are more graphically orientated than text, this is kind of what it would look like. If we were to break that out into cows, heifers, and bulls, we look at grading those lesions. So where it's not, there is presence of lesions, but less than 100, we call that grade 1. Where there's between 100 and 1,000, we call that grade 2. And where there's grade 3 or greater than 1,000, you can see how that's graphed out. So majority of the cows affected, but those with significant amount of lesions reduces in all populations. The question we always want to ask ourselves is, what about New Zealand? So there was an observational study that was conducted by Boehringer Ingelheim on the North and South Island across abattoirs in New Zealand, where similar studies or similar data was collected to look at these Osteigia nodules or these hyperplastic gastritis, and these are the sorts of things that you will see when you look at these stomachs in the abattoir. What was found with the New Zealand data was very, very similar to overseas. So from a point of view of the North and South Islands, if we look at the North Island first, around about 55% of the cases in the North Island were grade 2 or 3, so having greater than 100 lesions. From the South Island, again, around about 60% had grade 2 or 3 lesions. So certainly we are seeing evidence of hyperplastic gastritis in our herds in New Zealand, and that reflects that ongoing challenge. So if we reflect then on those 2 points, the second point, we understand that the effect of gastrointestinal nematodes does impair production. That really then leads us to the question, well, if that's the case, should we be targeting our treatments or should we be blanketing our treatments if we have gastrointestinal nematodes that we need to address in this population? Really, from a point of view of what I've just shared with you, we can understand that that the effects of those gastrointestinal nematodes may have impact on appetite and weight gain, and that could have productivity detriment, as it were. So, if we are to treat, when is the right time to treat, and what animals should we be treating? Now, I've already mentioned that a lot of these animals don't have fecal egg count, positive fecal egg counts. So it makes it a little bit more challenging to strategically target these animals using fecal egg counts. We could target the heifers. They're more likely to be fecund or egg producing, given that their immunity will be less developed than those multiparous cows. So that's one way we could think about it. Unfortunately, I don't have a special cowometer or parasitometer that I can talk to you about tonight to say these are the cows that you should treat and these are the cows that you shouldn't treat. I think when we look at targeted treatment of animals, of adult dairy cattle, we really need to take it on balance with multiple factors across the herd. Looking at the young stock, potentially taking on information such as body condition score, the productivity of those cows to make informed decisions. And it's a discussion that I encourage you to have with your veterinarian. Now, I mentioned talking or targeting the younger animals or the heifers. And the question always comes up as, well, what do we do with those adult cows? Should we just leave those alone? Will they be okay? And whilst this work was in Angus cross beef cows, I think it is relevant, and it shows that the effects of parasite load over the mating and gestation period has similar effects to other inflammatory conditions such as mastitis or lameness. In this particular study, they concluded that the immune system was causing a response to those parasites actually had a negative impact on the fertility in those animals. So, at the end of the day, if we've got multiparous cows that have a history of being difficult to get into in calf, perhaps that's another factor that we could bring into play in relation to targeting of our treatments. So what was the impact of treating those worms on those reproductive parameters? I'm just going back to some work by Sanchez, where they looked at the study into the impact of treating worms with EPRINEX on reproductive performance. Now, this study was not done in New Zealand, but they demonstrated an improvement in the calving to conception with the treated group, which was equivalent to around about 9 days improvement in our 6-week in calf rate. Similarly, this same study showed that the impact of treating the worms with EPRINEX on the reproductive parameters also gave a potential for increase of milk over the whole lactation. So that improvement of utilisation of feed and those aspects carrying through into production as well. Now, from that perspective, we're often asked, what might that benefit look like in a New Zealand context? And from that perspective, the data that we use is not our own data. We use independent data that was produced by organisations outside of Boehringer Ingelheim. And it's a fortunate position that we find ourselves in, that EPRINEX has this independent peer-reviewed data to support this economic response following treatment of adult dairy cows. And essentially this work, there was 2 sets of work, but work came out of Massey in 2017 and looked at the effect of mid-lactation treatment with EPRINEX on milk production on 9 New Zealand dairy farms. And essentially what that looked like was a lift of 0.03 kilos of milk solids per day. If we put that into the average herd, 0.3 of a kilo, average lactation 272 days, we get around about 8.22 kilos of milk solids per cow per lactation. If we do that to the milk price, I've used $9.50 there as opposed to the forecast $10, and that would equate to around about $77.50 per cow per lactation. If we minus off the treatment cost, around about $5, it's a net benefit of close to $73 per cow per lactation. So an average herd size of 500, in that instance, you the study would indicate that you would get a $36,000 return on investment from that treatment. Looking at it another way, for every 45 cows treated, you get an equivalent of 1 cow's worth of milk for a season. And from the average herd, that's about 10 cows that we'd have to carry to produce the same amount of milk. So from an efficiency perspective, from producing more milk with less, sort of aligns with those aspects too. So look, I've touched on 3 areas. We'll just pause there to see if there's any questions before we talk a little bit about when to treat. Really just looked at the three different areas to try to think about provoking some thought around drenching those adult cattle.
There's just one question that's come through for you, Carl. Do you think wearables would be of help, either looking at who to treat or response to treatment?
That's a really good question, and I'm not an expert on wearables. It's there's certainly a lot of data. All of the different companies, whether you've got intraruminal devices, collars, ear tags, produce different sorts of data. There are a number of veterinarians in New Zealand who have really incorporated that data into their businesses and are much better positioned to answer that question than I am. But I think from an overarching answer, there probably is some data in some of those aspects that could be utilised to identify whether or not an animal is not right, whether it would equate to this is parasites. I'd yet to be convinced.
Oh, hold on, someone's just typing.
Is that the only one?
There's just someone typing, so there must be, they've come up with another question for you, so just give them a moment.
All right, we'll pause. I'll take a breath. I'll take a sip of coffee. I won't sleep tonight.
There's something to keep me
Actually,
going.
I didn't realise that question's from Garth. Garth, what are your thoughts? Question without notice. Sorry, Garth.
That's okay. Here's another question for you. Is there any reported allergic reaction on the drug?
That's a really good question. So with any drug that you administer, regardless of what it is, there is a potential for an animal to have an allergic reaction. We monitor all of our products through an extensive pharmacovigilance system globally, and whilst there may well have been allergic reactions to the drug over time, in the time that I've been in the role, has been no reported cases in New Zealand that have come through. If you were suspecting that there was an allergic reaction to EPRINEX, the best thing to do is to report that to your veterinarian or directly to Boehringer, so that we can ensure that is covered off in our pharmacovigilance system. And the New Zealand trial, thank you, Tiffany. So the one I was referring to there was in 2017, the Lawrence study. And if I just flick back, I'm having a senior moment for the McPherson study, which was done in 2001. There are a number of other studies that have been done in New Zealand as well, Tiffany, but the two that I was talking to there, 2017 and 2001.
What is the efficiency for lice?
Yeah, efficacy for lice. Yeah, so EPRINEX has a claim for lice on the label, so it does treat lice. And there are a number of different treatments for lice with available in New Zealand. And if you are using EPRINEX, there is a label claim for the treatment of lice as well.
And Garth has just come back with a reply to you there. I think the ability to look at grazing behaviour in adults and also young animals gives a huge opportunity to back up data from what historically were very expensive trials.
I think that's a great point, Garth, and it would be wonderful if some of those trials we had access to those data to correlate the two. So, good point. Okay, if there's no other questions, I will move forward. If I can find my little cursor again, where's it gone? So if you're wanting to calculate the potential benefits on your herd, we do have a website called Future Producers, where you can put in your own herd details and it will come up with a little calculation for you. I won't go to that now, but what I just want to finish off on, give you about another 5 or 10 minutes, is just discussing some options for when to treat adult cattle for worms. It's really just a case of considering a few aspects, not suggesting that you treat at all of these times, but just some considerations as to when you might get the best benefit. So if we think about a typical spring calving herd, it may be sensible to treat around calving. If we look at these graphs here, time around calving, our energy stores are decreasing, our energy demand is increasing, and generally speaking, that larva on the pasture is starting to increase too. So from that point of view, treating at that time makes the most of the pasture metabolizal energy, and it can get the cows back on the right track before peak milk yield and cycling for mating, as it were. That's one option. Another one is if we look at when the pasture larval burdens are creeping up. They do creep up in the spring. That could potentially be a time when you could do a whole herd treatment. There's a lot of significant amount of contamination on the ground at that time. And over that period of time, there would have been a build-up of those hyperbiotic larvae and the potential for that hyperplastic gastritis due to the amount of challenge that's occurred over those preceding months. So that's another option. A third one, which is probably a really good time to be selective with your treatments, is to look at sort of your January, between January and February time. So when you're doing your first scanning, at that time, we've got a lower body condition score, and at the end of the day, it could be a good time to target those animals with that low body condition score or the early calvers and have some selective treatment at that stage. Again, that's just 3 options. Again, as I said right at the start, always good to discuss these options with your veterinarian to identify, how, what, when, and where to use these treatments and make informed decisions. So in summary, I just want to finish off by saying that when we use EPRINEX, the chances of causing or adding to resistance in adult dairy cattle with 1 or 2 targeted treatments per year is actually extremely low. When we think about adult dairy cattle, they are affected by invading larvae, and that can have an impact on their appetite and therefore their production. And if we think about which product to use at that time, EPRINEX is the only evidence-based product with data demonstrating significant returns on investment, and that's not only in New Zealand but globally. And as I mentioned, the only drench that has those 439 post-registrational studies globally to support its use. If you want to head to the Future Producers website, you can use your phones and scan that little QR code. That was my attempt at being very modern today. And alternative, if you point your browser at www.futureproducers.co.nz, you'll find yourself able to see the EPRINEX page and the calculator too. I just want to thank you all for bearing with me for just over half an hour. And if there's any further questions, I'm happy to take them.
Thank you, Carl. That was really informative. I don't have any questions, so I'm hoping someone else might throw some more at us. Alternatively, if you don't want to type them down, feel free to hit the raise your hand and I can unmute you so that you can ask your question directly to Carl. So it's hard when no one asks any questions. You hope that you haven't put anyone to sleep.
I haven't had my dinner yet, so it means I get an early dinner.
That's true. Well, if no one's got any more questions, then we can leave it there. Thank you again, Carl and the Boehringer team for coming on board. And oh, here's another question for you. Unique seasonal events such as droughts change worm levels on pasture in autumn. What would you, Len, I think your question got cut off.
I think that's what would you do, maybe.
Okay. What would you suggest? There we go.
Thank you, Lynn. Yeah, look, Lynn, I think when we think back to those the larvae on pasture graphs that I showed towards the end, generally speaking, larvae like wet environments. So when you have got a drought, heat, the larval survivability decreases, and that means that there's potentially less challenge on those animals. So at times when there is droughts or hot weather, in those instances, you may be able to reduce your inputs of drenches. Again, I'd encourage you to talk to your veterinarian about that. Not only do you need to look at your adult cattle, but also those younger animals, which I know we haven't spoken about today. They're a really good indicator of what's actually going on farm. They have a much more reliable correlation between parasite burden and fecal egg counts. So doing a bit of monitoring and testing in those areas to see whether or not drench is required would be my suggestion.
Cool.
Great question. Thank you.
Got another one coming through for you. At least no one's asking you hard questions.
Well, that one was we'll see. You've just jinxed me now. This next one will be like, I don't know.
It's fine. If you don't know, you don't know. It's fine.
That's exactly right.
Nope,
Thank
not
you,
a
Karen.
question.
Thank you, Karen. Brilliant.
All right, then. If no one's got anything further, then we'll leave it there. Thank you, Carl, for your presentation tonight. It was really informative. And I think if people want to learn more about the EPRINEX product or anything else, you can visit the website that Carl has given you. If you missed the link and you do want to get the link, this will be available up on our YouTube channel as of tomorrow. So you'll be able to get it off there as well. But other than that, yeah, thank you. That was really great. And it's awesome that we get to do these partnerships with, oh, cool. Thanks, Carl. These partnerships with Boehringer. Boehringer's been in partnership with Holstein Friesian New Zealand for over 25 years. So it's great that we can now do these webinars with you guys and podcasts as well to kind of advance in our partnership.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting us.
Oh, all right. Well, I'll leave it there. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.